people who are on Medicaid are already basically at their last resort. The only thing that's left after Medicaid is private charity, which may be there or may not be there depending on where you are and who you are and so forth. The other thing that Medicaid does is that it protects the resources, the property, and Ron Paul likes to talk a lot about property, the property of the U.S. middle class in the age of Alzheimer's and increasing costs for nursing home care. This actually protects, and I was at a party just before Christmas where a guy brought this up, right, that his mother had passed away after a long illness, and part of the care for her was covered by Medicaid, although he was firmly in the middle class, right, living in a home in Bethesda, Maryland. This protected him from going destitute with his wife and his son. So it's a very, very big cut for the health of poor people, where obviously we have 40 to 50 million still uninsured, unless and until something else kicks in, which we're not sure of, and this protection for families who have an elderly parent, say in a nursing home, so that doesn't eat your entire asset pool that you've got. And then I think probably the most extreme and maybe the most characteristic, food stamps. Now, food stamps have been used by, I'm afraid, Republican demagogues to characterize Obama, right? That I think Gingrich says Obama is the food stamp president and Gingrich wants to be the job president. Well, I think the scandal is not that the program exists, but that it's actually needed. Right now, about 50 million Americans live on food stamps. And this is not a generous benefit. If you're one person, the maximum food stamp benefit is $180, and that's the maximum. If you have a little bit of property or a little bit of savings, then it becomes less than that. So Ron Paul wants to cut $50 billion out of an $80 billion program. In other words, a cut of 63%, almost two-thirds. So again, Pentagon 15%, food stamps cut 63%. And if we just do the arithmetic, it means that the maximum benefit would not be in the area of $180 a month for one person. It would go down to something like $60 a month or $15 a week. Now, try eating anything that can keep body and soul together for $15 a week. And I think if we look at, in particular, the inherent problems of the child nutrition and child health on the one side, and then if we look at the broad-based impact on the poor, right, because the people who get Medicaid and the people who get food stamps are likely to be, quite a few of them, the same people, and they're getting cut between one-third and two-thirds. I think you can see a tendency, and what I mean by that is this. We've been burned by Obama, right? Obama said, vote for me, I'm not Bush, I'll put an end to the wars and the abuses of the Bush administration, and instead, he basically starts a war with Pakistan, certainly starts a war with Libya, claims the right to assassinate American citizens, carries that out in one case. He claims that he can incarcerate you in Guantanamo Bay and indeed torture you if you have opinions that he considers dangerous. So instead of what we were promised, we got something quite different. Now, if you look at the Republicans, right, with Boehner and the House Tea Party majority, they ran talking about jobs, but instead when they got in, it was tax cuts for the rich and their strange ideas about social policy. So I think we have to ask, is a bait and switch in progress here, where Ron Paul talks about peace and opposition to dictatorship and totalitarianism on the home front, but instead we seem to be getting a draconian, brutal series of budget cuts. And one or two other things about this. There is the Davis-Bacon Act, landmark legislation, and what it prescribes is that if you have a federal construction project, then that has to pay union wages. It's called the prevailing wage standard. And prevailing wage is interpreted to mean union wages, union pay scales. So you're not going to get a federal construction job and then be expected to work for the federal minimum wage. It's significantly higher. If you wipe out the Davis-Bacon Act, then this essentially destroys a whole series of trade unions. And the savings on this, $6 billion, but at the same time, look at the social impact, right? The trade unions would cease to exist. The combination of Ron Paul, the father, and Senator Rand Paul, the son, right, senator from Kentucky, what they both want to do is to change the Taft-Hartley law, which currently governs union policies, at least at the federal level. They want it so that instead of having a state's right to choose to be a union state, or to put it the other way, instead of having some states that have chosen to be right-to-work states where organizing unions is almost impossible, this is the Southern Belt in general, the Rand Paul and Ron Paul too, they want to essentially have a compulsion at the federal level that everybody has to be a right-to-work state. So between the abolition of the Davis-Bacon Act and the universal right-to-work status, there would be no trade union movement left. Now, I wonder about this. First of all, Ron Paul talks about states' rights all the time. But right now we have a state's right to choose not to be a right-to-work state. And my interpretation of Ron Paul's policy and his son's is that they want to change that so that you're no longer allowed to be anything but a right-to-work state. So states' rights, in their interpretation, goes out the window. Interesting contradiction, wouldn't you say? The other thing is, if you want to have resistance to totalitarianism, and we saw this, for example, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? The point at which that took off was the moment when the Communications Workers of America, the Transport Workers Union, the American Federation of Teachers, and others, when they showed up to swell the ranks of the protesters there at Zuccotti Park, you could see the idea that if you had some kind of a fascist coup, or if some president went over the line, right, bonkers in terms of crushing civil liberties, the only hope for organizing a general strike and other forms of resistance against that would be a union, would be a trade union movement, even such as it is. It would be the starting point. But somehow between Ron Paul and Rand Paul, they want to wipe out the only institutions that could mount a resistance against totalitarian measures of that sort. So, on the whole, rather strange, wouldn't you say? The other thing here is, if we look at Ron Paul's tax policy that goes with this, and I'm now basically making the transition over into the tax side of the ledger.
Well, he wants to keep the Bush tax cuts, right? Permanently.
Oh, absolutely. He wants to keep the Bush tax cuts, and he wants to add, he wants to keep these Bush tax cuts, which, as everybody knows, inordinately, exorbitantly favor the rich. He wants to keep the Bush tax cuts, and he wants to abolish the capital gains tax. Now, if you look at the U.S. economy, you would have to say that one of the principal problems of the U.S. economy is this over-financialization, the extreme emphasis on financial services, right? Non-productive financial services, speculation, moving paper around, the 1.5 quadrillion or so of derivatives, with much of it focused here in the United States. Ron Paul would essentially subsidize further parasitical speculation and related activities by simply abolishing the capital gains tax, so that if you were a full-time speculator, you would pay no taxes at that level, right? In terms of the capital gains, that money would be for you, right? You wouldn't pay income tax on it. But if you were a worker, you would pay a tax. So no capital gains tax and no estate tax, or as he would call it, no death tax. So it means that if you were a speculator who made out like a bandit in the Reagan bubbles of the 80s and the irrational exuberance of Greenspan in the 90s and into the current bubble economy of the wealth effect and so forth, that the last chance to have you contribute to the public treasury will be gone because Ron Paul wants to give you an absolute free ride. The interesting thing is he wants to cut the corporate income tax down to 15%. The corporate income tax is really not paid by a whole lot of very large entities, right? General Electric, notoriously under Immelt, paid zero corporate income tax in the most recent year that I'm aware of. But Ron Paul says even bring that down, right? Bring it down from, I think the current level is 35%. Bring that down to 15%. All right. So this is tax relief for speculators, tax relief for those who are already rich and who want to inherit, and tax relief for corporations, including banks. So is there any tax relief for the average person? And the answer is no. There is no proposal to cut anybody's taxes beyond that. In other words, you could imagine somebody saying, well, I'd like to increase the size of the personal deduction, right? The standard deduction could go up. The personal exemption could go up, right? That would raise, there would be the rising tide that would lift all boats from below. But with Ron Paul, there's absolutely nothing like that. There's no tax relief for anybody except a speculator, you're already rich, or a corporation.
Well, isn't he also proposing to eliminate taxes on foreign profits?
Yes, of course. In other words, he wants to essentially reward corporations that have hoarded money abroad, essentially evading U.S. taxes. He wants to basically have an amnesty, allowing them to bring this home with no mechanism to be sure that this got invested in plant and equipment as distinct from derivatives or speculation, and no taxation of it, right? So this would be in addition to these other cuts. So you'd have to look at this and say, if you're the Koch brothers, the richest man in New York City, Koch, or Koch, as he likes to call himself, putting on airs, the Koch brothers or the Koch brothers, as I think it says in the spelling that I can see, they would be delighted. Soros would be delighted. Soros was also delighted with Ron Paul's drug policy. We can maybe get to that later on. But generally speaking, this is precisely what Wall Street demands. And there are indeed reports that in the 1990s, if not more recently, Ron Paul was financed by the Koch brothers, right? The Koch brothers, the people who founded the Cato Institute, or who made important contributions at the beginning to make the Cato Institute possible. That's the leading libertarian think tank here in Washington, D.C. Quite plausible that they would have given some money to a leading libertarian presidential candidate going back there, Ron Paul.
I'm speaking with economic historian and author Webster Tarpley. Today's show, Critique of Ron Paul's Austerity Plan. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. What 5 cabinet departments is Ron Paul proposing to eliminate?
Right, this was his fight with Rick Perry. Rick Perry wanted to eliminate 3 of them, but couldn't remember the third, and Ron Paul said, no, that's not enough. So they had a bidding war. Who was going to destroy more departments of the federal executive? Well, it's basically these. It's the Department of Energy goes to 0. The Department of Housing and Urban Development goes to 0. The Department of Commerce goes to 0. The Department of the Interior goes to 0. The Department of Education goes to 0. Now, I should also mention this is within the framework of what he wants as a 10% cut in the total number of federal workers. In other words, I think the employees of the federal government are about 4.5 million. So if it's 10%, we're talking about 500,000 new unemployed, which would create severe depressed areas. Well, Washington, D.C. would certainly go, and Maryland and Virginia would all become a depressed area, and not just those. Some other ones would too. If you look at the Department of Energy, this has to do with, it has to do with maintaining all kinds of standards on, say, nuclear reactors, things like this. It has national laboratories are in there. Housing and urban development, right? There's not a lot of public housing being built in the United States, but what there is relies to some extent on subsidies coming from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. The Department of Commerce, that's among other things the U.S. Weather Service.